Hello, anybody and everybody out there. Welcome to this spontaneous broadcast from windowsontheworld.net. I'm Mark Windows, as you probably know if you're watching this. Last week we did a show called Freeman versus Technocracy, and I usually put up a trailer for the shows. Last week, though, I didn't. So the trailer for last week's show is actually this. And the information in that show, which is at the live page section at windowsontheworld.net and also under this video, is very important because people seem to be going down rabbit holes and cul-de-sacs. And these rabbit holes and cul-de-sacs were actually around 15 years ago. And I addressed them then. There is actually an article at windowsontheworld.net, and it's called Freeman versus Legal Fiction. And it goes into this so-called Freeman on the land concept, which has now been partly used to mislead people. And in that show, which is at windowsontheworld.net live shows page, you can find out how all this started, the history of it, and what the actual facts of the matter are, because there's people getting very confused going into rubbish really that doesn't work. So years ago, I had a website called landofthefree.co.uk, which has gone now, unfortunately. But we went into courts and looked at the practice of debt collection, bailiffs, how everything had kind of been deregulated, and took it all apart. And in that show, we go into some of the detail. So it's called Freeman versus Technocracy. And that's on the live shows page. But basically, tomorrow night, I'm going to put out another stream, which is going to go through some of the detail. And I'm going to do that live on here. So just to let you know that Sunday shows at Windows on the World are always uploaded by 9:30 p.m. UK time or live. Because of the time differences at the moment, I'm having a few problems. So sometimes I upload the show, but it's always there by 9:30 p.m. So the next show on windowsontheworld.net will be tomorrow night, just to confuse everybody or not. It will be uploaded by 9:30 p.m. That will be the latest show. But just recapping on this show, we put out a lot of information in that show called Freeman versus Technocracy. And basically, we even went into how accounts are created in your name and how to deal with this sort of stuff, because it's very low level, but it's going to become more and more important because as people become more financially challenged, shall we say, these things are going to be useful to get rid of. In other words, debts can be gotten rid of if you know what you're doing. But as I say, there's a lot of confusion about and people sort of mixing up issues. So they're mixing up this idea of free man on the land with other things which really have nothing to do with court procedure or what's actually going on. And we have covered that quite a lot. There's an article called What is Common Law? Check that out at windowsontheworld.net. Because I was watching some character, actually. I won't name him, but he goes around village greens and he's a bit like our character, Common Law Malcolm. And he talks about common law without knowing anything about how it's applied, and also making ridiculous statements which just aren't true. And once you start looking into the legal background, you can find out, well, for instance, there's lex scripta and lex non scripta. Lex non scripta defined law which was not written before 1189, but all law was written after 1189. So anything that was just common law and unwritten became common law and written after 1189. All this stuff is fascinating, but it can get extremely complicated. What I would say is there's people really simplifying this stuff, and they're making completely incorrect assumptions. And the sort of mistakes that people were making 10, 15 years ago are still being made. In that show, Freeman versus Technocracy, which is based on an article actually called Freeman versus Legal Fiction. I'll keep reiterating this so you can pick them up from the website. But there's so much stuff in there, and it goes into the registration of the person, the assumed liabilities of the person, what a person actually is, the legal fiction, why legal fictions are created, basically to transfer assets between interested parties. And of course, being registered makes you an asset. We have another very interesting article at windowsontheworld.net called Are You a Pauper? There's another one called Is a Birth Certificate a Death Certificate? And I go all into the occult law behind this. I find it absolutely fascinating. But in the times that we're living in now, a lot of this is of little importance. But what I would say is that it gives you a grounding in understanding how the system sees you, because the system now sees you as chattel goods of the IMF and World Bank. Previously, you were a person on a register or a roll, and you had been signed over to the registrar to be a roll, basically created in your name. An estate was created in your name by your parents, informing that a new revenue stream had been born. So all this stuff is very fascinating. I went into it years ago with researchers like Franco Collins, and we spent many hours talking about this stuff, looking over statute and all the rest of it. In the times that we're in, there is no rule of law. The rule of law has been absolutely usurped. So we have to fall back on natural law and the application of law. And the application of law can be very useful even now, because it defines where you are. It defines something called consent, informed consent, and people are being coerced. And actually, coercion is not very good because it's not really part of law. So any coercion, or basically people being hoodwinked into consent, is really not a very good idea. So people need to know where they are within the system. Absolutely. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to stop the camera for a minute, and I've got a bit of a noise going on in the background, which I'm going to get rid of. And back again. Yes, I'd actually set an alarm to do this because I'm in a different time zone. Let's just have a look at what people are saying out there now. I've given you that bit of information. Is that a brick wall or a green screen? Well, actually, it's a brick wall. I don't carry a green screen with me. But good, very early morning from Gulag, Australia. Bless my freedom-loving brothers and sisters. Well, I feel very sorry for you. What's going on in Australia there, Gally? Hello, Mark from Ireland. Hi, Richard. Mark, can you unban dragon dot something to think he was removed by mistake? Okay, well, I don't know what that's about, but I can unban people, I think. I don't think I've banned anyone in here for ages. But yeah, do have a look at that show, Freeman versus Technocracy. And I'm going to be uploading a new show at Windows on the World tomorrow. So yeah, we went into everything, the legal fiction, how estates are created in your name. Does this mean anything? No, you're just part of the GDP of the country. These things are futures. I actually found myself being traded, my birth certificate number, on Fidelity Investments in America about 10 years ago. Absolutely fascinating. I was Maryland Municipal Income Fund bond number 429 with a QSIP, and a friend of mine did it, and she actually came up as a different bond. So this is the way the GDP of the country's worked out. And really, it's interesting up to a point, but it's of no use to you because there's people out there who think that they can cash this money in or somehow it belongs to them. Well, it's a legal fiction. It doesn't exist. We're in a fiat currency system. So basically, none of that really matters. And we get into that in that show. So I didn't do any advertisement for that last week. So do please have a listen to that. But yes, it's all about consent. Everything is about consent. And if you don't have informed consent, then it's not legal. It's actually not legal. And that is part of the ancient history of the Isles of Britain. So, yeah, we get into all sorts in that show: council tax, administrative courts, and the traps that people are still being pushed into. I looked at the way that the bailiff industry, for instance, was completely deregulated about 10 to 15 years ago. Basically, these people are now private debt collectors. Of course, Marston's, the bailiff company in Rossendale's, were bought out by Rothschild Investments. And that was an indication as to how things were going, because we're seeing the privatization of everything. That, of course, is the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals are all about corporations taking control of everything, so governments don't have to. Clearly stated in documents like Our Common Future in 1987. Take a look at another talk on windowsontheworld.net called The Plan to Rule the World. And that was a talk I gave at the Glastonbury Symposium in 2019. And it outlines really the blueprint for what's going on now. COVID, of course, has accelerated that by 1,000 miles an hour. Yes. So this week, I'm also going to be releasing more from the Heretics of London, the Smithfield Martyrs. There's going to be a special preview on Wednesday, and I'll probably do a live stream after that. So this is really just to inform people that the shows are still there every Sunday, 9:30 p.m, windowsontheworld.net. And please have a look at Freedom versus Technocracy, or Freeman versus Technocracy. And also that article, Freeman versus Legal Fiction. I'll actually link them underneath here, because there's very important information in that. And it ties into a lot of other stuff you can find on the website. If you go into the archive on the website, you'll find a huge amount of very important data. The reason it's important now is because the system that we're in is adequately described in the back catalogue of the shows. Yeah, let's see. Well, there's quite a few people here. And what I'm going to do is tomorrow night, I'm going to do a whole show on here, which will cover everything in those articles and point you to all the relevant information, because I think this show is so important that it needs a bit of a follow-up. So I'll be doing that tomorrow night, and do check out the back catalogue. So I think that's about all I've got to say on here, and I will be back with Windows on the World tomorrow evening, which is Monday. That's Monday the 23rd, Monday the 23rd. So that'll be great. Also, I did a show with James Collins in Ireland, and it lasted about 12 hours on YouTube. And we went into some of the background of what I've been talking about through this, in that I described how I got into looking at court procedure and how things had started to go wrong, how the administrative court system had taken over, how assumptions were being made on your behalf, and really what to do about it. And that opened up a huge area. I think coming into this from the angle of the law is really important, because you learn to define clearly what is being said, even when you're looking at the media and the gaslighting and the lies of the media. You realize that these are not legal arguments. These would fall down in a court of law. And of course, when we talk about this, it's quite funny. I was looking at some of these Facebook groups on climate change. They're all very controlled. And you have these people on there constantly posting stuff by these fraudsters like Michael Mann. And of course, it's almost like ClimateGate and the hockey stick graph have been wiped out of history. Look on Google now, you can't find this stuff. So really the consensus has taken over. But when you apply a legal argument to the claims made by the lobbyists for the fake environmentalism, or Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, they fall down in court. In 2018, we covered that. There was a case in San Francisco, and we had Miles Allen, who's a climate modeler from Oxford University, who's actually involved in the climate assemblies. And the judge rebuked Miles Allen for making it look like there was 1,000 times more CO2 in the atmosphere than there actually was. And Miles Allen got rebuked several times. So these people are fanatics. And that's where it's really interesting, because if you take things down to a legal argument, you strip down the language. Stripped down language. In other words, is this a fact or is it not a fact? And most of the time it's not a fact. It's basically come out of group consensus. And it's quite funny, really, because if you look back at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for instance, that was put together under the UN global governance system merely to prove that humans affected the climate. In other words, or to put it very succinctly, they took the sun out of the equation. So the sun doesn't cause warming on the planet, only humans do. When you start taking these things down to their logical conclusion and fact base, they fall apart. A bit like what's going on at the moment. That just falls apart when you look at the facts, because there's contradictory things going on everywhere that make no sense whatsoever. If it doesn't make any sense, then you want to start looking at the story and saying, well, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. Therefore, is there a legal basis for it? Is there an argument? An argument doesn't mean two people shouting at each other. It means two people who have a point which they are trying to reinforce, and one side will win. That's an argument, a legal argument. So I do find all this incredibly interesting. And the whole history of law, there's a great book called The History of Jurisprudence, which I think you can still look at on the internet. And it's got definitions in there, which you'd find absolutely fascinating. So all of this stuff was built up over hundreds and hundreds of years. And now you've got these idiots spouting common law who've read nothing of this stuff. They don't even know that common law is the basis of all statute law. These things are quite important because it's all about definition and being able to hold court, have an argument, and have standing. And all of this comes from these ancient assumptions that were made about you. And unless you know about that, you can come very unstuck within the legal system, as many people do. And I still see people making the same old mistakes, which is why I'm doing this tonight, just to reinforce that show we did last week on a live show page, windowsontheworld.net. Yes, jurisprudence should be taught in school. Well, of course, the reason it isn't is because you are a ward of the court. And of course, to gain competence, you need to be very competent or to be represented by a lawyer. So there's no good outcome for the state or even the new control system for people to know their rights. What are their real rights, their inalienable rights? Of course, this has all been taken away. And some researchers I used to speak to years ago said there's been no law, let's say the UK as an example, for 200 years. Well, in actual fact, that's probably quite correct, because once you start taking into account the admiralty system of law, which actually came into being used about 1200, and it was used by lawyers as well because they were making money out of it. So basically this idea of the county court and salvage and everything has to have the box ticked, otherwise it doesn't work. That's the interesting thing about administrative law. For instance, if you go to a Crown Court and they haven't spelt your name right, as long as they've got the corpus, the body of the person, and that is the accused, then the case can kind of go ahead. And the reason I say that is because I know people who've been summoned to Crown Court and they haven't even had their names spelt correctly. Now, in a county court, that would be thrown out. So there's something about administrative law that I quite like, because if the boxes aren't ticked, then it can't go ahead. But the problem we found was that the county court and the bailiff companies, the people within the county court and the people using the county court were, guess what? One big team. And these court cases were being done in private. Yes, in private. So in other words, the court cases weren't real court cases. They were basically by this internal mafia within the court. And government bodies were doing this, like the Child Support Agency. Councils have always done it, of course, and councils print their own summons and hire a room in a building which is usually known as a court. But if you take the council on with one of their bulk hearings, for example, my case was 127679. I counterclaimed against the council and won the case. Well, then they have to turn it into a real court case and they have a problem. But then there's a problem for you. Because if you've got a case that's going to be case law, it has to go onto the registry trust. But otherwise, it's not a recognised court case. So my court case was not on the registry trust. A lawyer at the local authority told me that basically they'd hidden it because it would have been case law, because I proved that the local council were actually creating fraud with a document that they purported to be issuing from their head of revenues and benefits, which actually came from a third-party data mining company in Nottingham called Data Tank, which is also linked to Experian. So I proved all this in court. And this is another thing I get into in that show. Very good point. That if you get any letter through the post, it doesn't matter whether it's from the police, the council, or an organization, you do not have to fill in their paperwork if you provide the information required by law yourself on your own documentation, which stops you getting entrapped into their preconceived contracts, which are actually really bad news because they are unconscionable. In other words, only a person of diminished responsibility or an imbecile would sign them or agree to them, because the police do this all the time. It's like, so where were you standing at the time of the murder? Well, actually, I wasn't there because I was somewhere else. These are the sort of questions they kind of coerce you into admitting an offence when there's no need to admit an offence. Basically, the burden of proof is on them. So always remember that. That's a great one, actually. If you supply the information required by law yourself on your own paperwork, strike through their paperwork and staple it to your response and put full response attached. And then they can't say that you've ignored their paperwork. And I've done that several times and it does work. What I will say is that everything I recommend does work. For instance, let's have a talk about debt collectors. Debt collectors buy the debt. The biggest debt collectors in the world, I think, were Frederickson International and Interlaken. And they started off in the early 30s, I think 1931. And they buy up millions of pounds worth of debt, say your own mobile phone debts and all that. If you have an agreement with your mobile company, a disagreement with your mobile company, they will sell all this stuff on. So you get all these little debts that they buy, and they buy them in tranches. So basically, once they've bought the debt, they've extinguished the debt because the debt can't exist if someone's bought it. So what they then do is they write to you and say, you have an account with them. Well, an account takes 2 signatures. You haven't got an account with them. That's why they're begging you to pay them. So then it goes down to the bottom feeders, people like Moorcroft in Stockport, where basically the debt has gone through so many hands, there's little chance of them recovering it. So they're basically asking you to get involved. And once you agree that you have this contract with them, this account, and start paying into it, then you've agreed to pay them. So what you actually do with these debt collectors, this is not legal advice, by the way, but it's law, is that you ask for the deed of assignment. Who assigned the debt to them? Where is the signature of the creditor and yourself to say that you've bought this debt, that you're pursuing it on behalf of the creditor? If you're not pursuing it on behalf of the creditor, then the debt, as I said, has probably been bought. So then you can ask for the account. When was the account set up? Where's my signature? Where's my signature and the signature of your CEO on that account? Where is it? Because if there's not my signature on it, it looks like this could be a case of fraud. I'm not saying it is a case of fraud, but it could be. These are really interesting things. And this is what I sort of got into years ago. And it gives you a great amount of confidence. And you realize that you're basically dealing with a kind of mafia type operation, really. It's all threats and menaces. And when you take it apart, there's not much there. And that goes into all the stuff we did years ago, from council tax to looking at administrative courts to groups of debt collectors who employ one solicitor, for instance, and they start sending you threatening letters about going to the county court. Now, most lawyers know this stuff has no standing, but it's up to you to know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, you get yourself into further trouble. And that's really what that show is about, Freeman versus Technocracy. It's a bit of a different subject than what we've been covering recently, but as I said a while ago, and as I've been covering, I want to actually be able to bring some solutions. And this stuff from days of old is actually still quite useful. Third-party interlopers, exactly, third-party interlopers. So they're interloping into a matter which could be private. And that's the interesting thing. But this idea of the administrative courts is incredibly fascinating. And if you go back into Windows on the World, you'll find loads of stuff about administrative courts, council tax, what it is about, what it isn't about, what it means, what it doesn't mean, what you can actually do and what you can't do. Because a lot of this stuff, especially with the council tax, doesn't go back to the 1992 Local Government Finance Act, which the people in your local council will tell you. It goes back to the poor laws of the 1500s. And if you did not carry, say, your certificate of settlement, which was the old version of a passport, a national insurance number, an identity document, that's from the 1500s. If you didn't carry that and you were not settled in another borough, you would be sent back to where you had come from. If you were not settled within 30 days, if you found yourself in front of the magistrate, and if you were vagrant, if you could not support yourself, and this went for children as well, they would be put into the workhouse. And if you look on your passport now, the passport is an updated version of the certificate of settlement. Check your passport type out, and unless you're a diplomat or some other official, it will say type of passport, P for pauper, because only a pauper needs to beg for travel. So therefore, if you were a divine sovereign being with inalienable rights, you wouldn't need a passport. You would have free passage, but you have to be granted it because you are assumed to be property within that system because of the registration at birth. Now, later on, we go to 1837, the Births, Deaths and Registrations Act. That's very interesting. And that article, Are You a Pauper? And the other one at windowsontheworld.net is a birth certificate, a death certificate, and it goes into the 7 years lost at sea rule. The Sestake V Act, which people talk about, of 1666, which was actually updated, which made us all lost at sea by the time we were 7 years old. Therefore, we were classed as property. And because we didn't rebut that assumption, then that assumption stands. Assumptions that aren't rebutted do stand, which is quite interesting, actually. And that is a big part of what's going on with the COVID action plan. Because unless you rebut an assumption and you do it with a steadfast argument, of course, that's very difficult when you have the opposition to the argument being absolutely disingenuous, lying, gaslighting, deceiving, then that is another indication that there's no rule of law anymore. There's no rule of law. So that's a big problem, and one that we will be addressing over the next few weeks and months. Do take a look at the back catalogue, and I'm going to be doing more of these live streams with people who are creating their own little communities. And I think that's what it's going to go down to. And I'm finding that very interesting, people who are preparing and doing stuff, because things are going so quick now. The world is basically being locked down, and locked down very, very quickly. And the idea of what's going on as far as protest goes is that it's part of the system. It's part of what was planned for. So the globalists actually need the anti-globalists to implement their policies. The anti-globalists have not much to do and no direction, so they are steered into the policies of the globalists. Now, the biggest example of this, of course, is Extinction Rebellion, which is a completely globalist organization, which is there merely to reinforce the narrative of the climate change and environmental agenda, which is all about getting you into a smart city, taking you off the land, stopping you traveling, and depopulating the planet, which, of course, Extinction Rebellion think is a great idea. So the useful idiots of these organizations are basically the enemy now. Quite interesting. I mean, Years ago, I investigated Occupy. You can find a very interesting film called Inside Occupy and the Bank of Ideas. The Bank of Ideas was a fake squat set up in the City of London. Who gets to squat in the City of London? Nobody. And that was all backed by the climate change people. We did a whole load of research into that. And you don't actually have to do that much research to find out that basically all the money from Occupy was stolen by Climate Camp Action, which was a part of an undercover policing operation. Proven. One of their officers, known as Dave Jones, was an environmental campaigner. It's all in an article called COVID Protest Social Engineers at windowsontheworld.net. And that links into how Climate Camp Action stole the money from Occupy St. Paul's, put it in the police bank account. And this is how it works. People don't realize that everything is infiltrated in that way. And of course, the big society is all about infiltration. How many people do you know in your neighborhood who are willing to snitch on you? I would say it's much more than 20 years ago. The UK has been absolutely ideologically subverted. Basically, most people are now citizen spies for the Global Action Plan. So that's another thing that people have to be really careful about. But as far as these movements go, I linked in one of these movements, which is at the back of these days out, shall we say, and they are linked to Climate Camp Action. They are linked to Green and Black Cross, which is Climate Camp Action. And you can find it all in that article. It's really interesting because it's so simple, this stuff, but nobody else seems to want to research it. But it's very important if you're going to be energy harvested, because the whole idea of this system is to energy harvest you. So it's to be steered into avenues of little importance, bread and circuses. So protest is exactly the same. So what it takes is small groups of determined people. I gave an example on James Collins' show, I think it was. Or was it on? I think it's in Freedom versus Technocracy, about these so-called secret societies. Of course, a real secret society you wouldn't know about. So the ones that we know about aren't secret. But the Rosicrucians, for instance, had an outer core of 12 brothers. But the hidden brother, the 13th brother, was hidden behind the 12, a bit like in a game of billiards, snooker, really. Or even pool, where you've got quite a few boards. So you've got a triangle, and at the back of that triangle is one ball. But if you're in front of that triangle, you can't see the ball at the back. And that's really basic stuff. And these organizations always did that. They had decoys, and just read about that stuff. It's really interesting because it's a great help if you're forming a little community group. Yes, do what the globalists do. Put some useful idiots out the front. Put some useful idiots out the front as a decoy, or just make sure you go along with all the mantras of sustainable development on the surface and do whatever you want behind it. This is how it's going to have to get. It's a full infiltration through the sustainable development goals. And if you look at The Guardian, nearly every week, they're talking about farmers rewilding. Well, what are farmers in the UK growing? Not very much. So they're going to be rewilding their land, giving more of their land over. In Scotland, they're now talking about introducing the links. They've been talking about this for years. And there's now called organization called Scotland, the Bigger Picture. And it's all about rewilding. All is the globalists need is these environmental Fruit Loops who fall for this stuff and think it's about environmentalism. And they use them as the front. And that's as much to it as there is, really. There's nothing else to it. That's actually what is going on. So all of this has to be taken into consideration. And if we look at what's happened in the UK with these sort of protests that have gone on, nothing has been achieved and there's nothing been said of any importance. And that is a big problem, because when we look at the people I've known over the years, really good investigative journalists from all over the world, and some of these people contacted me. I won't give the names out now, but they contacted me about my show and sent me a lot of information, even on things like 9/11, information that I would never have known about. Fascinating stuff. But all these journalists, the real journalists, have one thing in common. If they touch any area which is outside the accepted narrative of the Global Action Plan, they are disappeared from the internet practically overnight. And that's how it happens. And that's how we can now look on Google and not find out the fraud of Michael Mann or the IPCC or any of these scientists. All that you find is a rebuttal of what they're accused of without any evidence to back up their side of the story. So we are in an age of absolute deception. And I used to use an analogy, actually, which was the Nag Hammadi scriptures, the nature of the rulers. And they kept the children of the light in the dark for the entire age. But the children of the light didn't know it because they'd been hoodwinked by these watchers or magistrates, rulers, archons, whatever you want to call them. Of course, the watchers is a very interesting subject. Book of Enoch, absolutely fascinating book. That seems to be in 3 parts, though. I'm not sure it's complete, but a very fascinating insight. And of course, not in the King James Bible, but it's in the Ethiopian Bible, I think. I'm waffling here a bit, but this is quite good. Got 103 people watching this, and this is just a preview for basically a show I put up 7 days ago. So do have a look at that. Freeman versus Technocracy, and the article that goes with it, Freeman versus Legal Fiction, where we're talking really about the misleading nature of what's going on. And facts these days are few and far between. One thing I would say, though, is that everything that's on the website I've tried out. People seem to want to follow these remedy gurus. They were around years ago. People who were doing these talks, making big, bold statements, of course, with no foundation evidence. And once you ask them for the court case numbers, the documentation, of course, it doesn't exist. And a lot of people also, this is a very important point, they will say that they've had a victory in the court, and it's not a victory. This was very, very common quite a few years ago. People would say, a bit like common law Malcolm, we are winning. Well, actually, no, you lost. And I know people who got into such trouble because they stuck their basically they stuck their head in the sand and they wouldn't pull it out and they wouldn't give way. And this led to people losing their houses and all sorts. Of course, massive property grabs are on the way. This is all coming. I think the biggest thing, though, is to try and get back to some form of barter. I was saying this 10 years ago. This bartering system is going to become very important for those who are left out, those who are left behind, because as the UN say, no one will be left behind. But maybe then people are going to be left behind. I'm just going to read some of these comments. What do you think the rewilding is about? It's a land grab. It's privatization of the land. It's to restrict your access to the land, because by 2050 or 2025, the UN now want most people living in gulag smart cities run by the Internet of Things. Excuse me. So that's what rewilding is about. As I said earlier on, they put useful idiots at the front of it. The reason that they're going to put dangerous wild animals in there is because at some point a kid's going to go in there and get bitten, or an adult's going to get bitten, and they're going to say, well, it's too dangerous now. We can't have adults in there. All of this stuff was planned a very long time ago. The rewilding, the fourth world wilderness is also the wilderness of the mind. And that was the subject of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. The first world was the industrialized West. The second world was Russia. The third world was Asia and Africa. Parts of Asia and Africa, of course. Asia's really now almost first world, a lot of it. Because, well, where do you get your telly from? Where do you get your contents of your house from? Yeah, have a look at that. So that's really interesting. And they had this thing called the Fourth World Wilderness. And of course, the World Wilderness Congress started in 1987. And what they want to do is get everybody managed, controlled, and a very reduced population. There's nothing complicated about what's going on. The COVID action plan is merely a part of the population reduction and the control system. And it's rolling out 1 million miles an hour. Well, have a look at it. Anyone who's got a camper van will now know how much has been closed down over the past 5 years. It's absolutely incredible. They've been putting in height barriers so you can't get into places. They're saying no overnight camping. They're criminalizing it. All of these stupid newspapers like the Live Group with their communitarian press constantly turning the public against people in camper vans. Oh, look at the mess they've left behind. And these are just stupid non-stories that really don't have any evidence behind them. So the demonization of people who travel or want to live in camper vans has been going on for quite a long time. And now more and more people are trying to live like that. So all of this stuff is the same. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about rewilding, restriction of access to land. It's all part of the same thing. I was talking about it for a very long time. In fact, do have a look at George Hunt, UNCED, United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, 1992. It's called The Elite Plan Well Ahead. If you can't find it, go to windowsontheworld.net and have a look at an article with a lot of video and a huge amount of text called The Man Who Saw the Future. George Hunt blew the whistle on exactly what's happening now in 1992. And he spent the rest of his life trying to wake up the sleepyheads to what was coming. He exposed the Global Carbon Bank, the World Environmental Facility, and he exactly knew what was going on because he was at that conference where Edmund de Rothschild, Stephen Rockefeller, and Maurice Strong got up and made statements which were so outlandish that it's taken a very long time for people to let that sink in. The industrialized West was going to be collapsed. Everything was going to be rationed. And yes, the fourth world wilderness, the wilderness of the mind, would be induced through the New Age, through drugs and through propaganda. And it's worked absolutely amazingly well. So following the history of this, which I have done for a very long time, is not actually that difficult. The problem the public have is they can't see the bigger picture or join dots. They think that these people in local government and national government are actually in charge of something. Of course they're not. They are implementing the goals and the policies of the globalists. All of this came out of sustainable development, which according to the globalists means everything and nothing. It was originally defined as the rights of people in the present without impacting upon the rights of people in the future, or words to that effect. Communitarianism, really implying that all rights come with responsibilities. And then they talk about community rights, the rights of a community. A community doesn't have rights. A community is a group of individuals who all have individual rights who are part of a community. That's the deception. So when you hear the word community, you're talking about the allowed corridor of opinion. Anything outside it is demonized. Anything outside of it would probably think that Elvis lives on the dark side of the moon, and they're probably a right-wing conspiracy theorist. And that is the state of the world and its so-called journalists, many of whom are just generating and cut and pasting nonsense from one publication to the next. So there are no journalists left, and any journalists who are left are completely marginalized. So yeah, interesting. But the communitarian system, something we've talked about. If you don't know what it is, go to windowsontheworld.net, and there's a very loose summation of that. The term communitarianism was coined in 1841 by John Goodwin Barnby, who was also a communist, and originally it meant ideas of a communist nature. By I think 1909 it had been changed in Webster's to relating to a community. And then we got Amitai Etzioni with his responsive community. Amitai Etzioni was an advisor for the Clintons, for the Bush government, and he is part of Columbia University. Look him up. He's hugely influential. But when you look at what this is and how it's presented, it's completely deceptive. It masquerades as community, but it's totalitarianism. So in other words, the dictatorship at the top defines what the community is. The community never defines anything. It's defined for them. And that has really come to pass. And the word to describe that is communitarianism. It's very disingenuous the way it's been used and the way it's been taken over since 2010 in the UK. David Cameron's Big Society. I talked about this on Richie Allen's show a few weeks ago. But that was when I started seeing these change agents embedding themselves into local government, and they would not move on their opinions. Then I saw the steering in the meetings, the so-called Delphi Technique. The first time I saw that was at Occupy St. Paul's, when they brought in the undercover police and the facilitators. Aka George Soros facilitated meetings. Whenever you see the word facilitator, whenever you see the word consensus, it means choice is being removed, a bit like the climate assemblies. You go there for 3 days, you get brainwashed into IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, propaganda with no foundation evidence to back up what they're saying, and you're not allowed to argue a fact. That's the consensus. And we've done so much work on this over the years. Citizens' assemblies, community assemblies. Whenever you see the word assembly, you might want to consider whether you are being coerced into something in groups of 10 on tables, or smaller groups by a facilitator and a co-facilitator who are steering you into the already predicted outcome. And it's so simple to do. I could not believe it when I first saw this. I came out a little bit bamboozled. It was about 15 years ago at a council meeting, and it was at an local arts thing, I think. I used to go along to them because I wanted to see the phonies who were there basically parading this nonsense. And I knew that they were hoodwinking the people who were there. But as soon as I learned about the Delphi Technique, which was invented by the Rand Corporation in 1953, it's a way of gaining group consensus. So if you've got a corporation, you want everyone to agree. So you make it look as though they've agreed. There's not much to it, really, not much more to it than that. They take it to a panel at the end, like the climate assembly. And of course, the panel is all pro. So anybody who doesn't believe in anthropogenic global warming isn't on the panel or can't actually participate, because that's a given. So the lie is a fact. So basically, they're presenting the big lie as a complete fact. So whatever you say to go against that is going to be completely ignored. And of course, you think Elvis lives on the dark side of the moon, you're far right, and you're probably a Trump supporter. I thought that was funny, actually. Well, not funny, tragic, on Sky News Australia, where there was people protesting, and they did this spin on it that some girl had been with the protesters and got injured. No, she'd been injured by the police with either tear gas or hit by a rubber bullet. I'm not sure. You can check it out. It's on there. But then, of course, what Sky News did in Australia is they interviewed probably the only person who was talking about Donald Trump. So they found a Trump supporter. What do you need to demonize everyone? Yes, a Trump supporter. So they found one. Talk about 1984. We're in it, and a brave new world as well. I mean, the technocratic side of it I find really interesting, because Technocracy Inc. is still there. And the technocrats really were part of this group called the British, the eugenicists, the people who became basically nationalists, like Cecil Rhodes, Alfred Milner, all these people who were at the back of this group called the British. And they were originally nationalists. Then, of course, it became bigger, so they became internationalists. Now they're globalists. So this idea of a sort of patriotic aspect to any particular country is completely wiped away. And it was, of course, because we've been hearing about global governance since the Blair era. Gordon Brown talking about it. Global governance. Global governance is not world government. It's not national government. It's a big web of corporate entities which were put into place following the Rio conference, and really going on from a document called Our Common Future, which you can download at windowsontheworld.net. And basically it talks about how are people to be made to go along with this. How are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? Well, we're going to do it by telling them they're saving the planet and there's too many of them. And they're going to agree to that because obviously it's virtuous for them to believe they're saving the planet. It's simple as that. There's nothing else to it. Very, very simple. Yeah, Fabian socialism at its best. Well, yes, but I think we're onto a different thing now. This technocratic sort of era, Internet of Things control, top-down control through corporate control, which is actually not that effective, really. Because if you look at what they're doing with the biometrics industry, it's very competitive. And they're installing all this stuff. But I think a lot of it is going to fall apart because these people are greedy. They're very greedy. And I don't think they're as well organized as people think they are. But yeah, the globalists see countries as part of an operating system. So every country has its little idiosyncrasies. This is what they seem to believe, that they give countries a little bit of what they want and then drag them into where they're going. And once you know that, then you can see the signs of it. It's very, very simple, very, very simple what they're doing. And the whole idea of global governance is it actually does make things really simple. What's this? Who's on the wheel? Please read What We Owe Each Other, A New Social Contract for a Better Society by Minouche Shafik. It's only short. I'll have a look at that because I think someone else mentioned that before. But a lot of these documents I find very, very similar. These globalist documents, all the ones that are about sustainable development. And it doesn't matter which one you look at or which conference or which person, they're all trained into this mantra of sustainability, vibrant communities, resilience. Now, resilience is the scary one, isn't it? Resilience is really scary because that's basically means police state lockdown, smart cities, resilient cities. They're talking about resilience now. Well, Australia's resilient under martial law. So the resilience aspect is pretty scary. But I'm sure many of you out there have seen these plans for these detention centres. This is very, very creepy. Of course, it's all about biohazards and keeping you safe, which is the big communitarian we. And of course, now we've got the divide and rule of the public. Very, very serious situation, I think. Yeah, Rockefeller's Resilient Cities. I've read all that stuff. Yeah. These documents, they're all pretty much the same. They're all saying the same thing. They have to, because what they're imposing is so draconian. It has to be taken down to some simplistic definition, as David Lang, the Montreal investment banker, said in 1992 at the Denver, Colorado conference, that the cannon fodder that unfortunately inhabit the earth need a simple definition to relate to. And that simple definition is sustainable development, which is control and management and reduction of population and restriction of all. In other words, rationing and taking you off the land. So when someone said, what's rewilding about? That's what it's about. It's to get you off there. It's not giving it back to nature. It's taking it from you. A little bit like they did in the Middle Ages with the laws that came in, and the Enclosures Act and the Erection of Cottages Act. All this sort of stuff was going on then. But that was feudalism. Now we've got globalism. So these now the landed gentry have lost all of their power or given it away to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Look at Scotland, what they're doing up there. All the lairds are really virtue signaling to be on board with the rewilding, of course. And of course, many of the UK's farmers. So, yeah, about time to start growing your own food as well and being more self-sufficient. I've been on here quite a long time, but I think there's some interesting points being made. Do join me tomorrow. I'm going to do the live show tomorrow. WindowsOnTheWorld.net live shows by 9:30 p.m. UK time. And on Wednesday, I'm going to release another section of the film, The Heretics of London. Excuse me, the Smithfield Martyrs. Sturgeon is Hitler. Well, actually, she's just a useful idiot. These people aren't very bright. In fact, they're quite stupid. And it doesn't really matter which one of them you choose. But yeah, they've put her in to completely destroy up there, north of the borders in Scotland. And she's done a really good job so far. And she's taken all of the life, well, a lot of the life out of the country because people are becoming very apathetic. And that's what it's all about. It's enclosure in negative. Globalism is 21st century feudalism. That's right. That's what I've just said, really. When we talk about, the certificate of settlement, This new COVID passport, the health pass, it's just an updated technocratic version of that, but done on a very, very deceptive, shall we say, premise. I don't think there's been anything like this happen before. This has got to be, yes, it's the biggest one of the century. Definitely. It's bigger than anything else. It's bigger than 9/11. It's bigger than 7/7. It's bigger than anything. It's bigger than any manufactured war. This is World War III. And in a lot of countries around the world, actually, people are calling it World War III. I'm not sure whether people are calling it that in the UK. But yeah, he said, take Walthamstow. I used to live there, actually. And I took that council on and won against them and caused them a tremendous amount of embarrassment, which was fantastic at the time. Yeah, Walthamstow, the serfs live bivouacked around the high street and other shopping streets. The properties are, for the most part, rentals. The landowners, landlords don't live there. Yeah, of course. What they did in that borough was they used to give very cheap rents to shops for 6 months. And then, of course, they'd have to pay the full business rates, which are pretty extortionate. So, yeah, nothing new there, really. That borough is quite interesting because it was the first one to have Mini Holland. And Mini Holland was, they won it, of course. We've won. What have we won? All our roads are going to be closed off. No one's going to be able to drive. No one's going to be able to get emergency vehicles in. And basically, we're just going to close the whole area down so you can't get out. That's what you've won. But it's all sustainable, so don't worry about that. Very clever the way they did it, because they got all the yuppies in there, all the climate change believers and the daydream believers. They got them all in there thinking it was some kind of new part of trendy sphere of London. So they're walking around like it's Primrose Hill or something, but it's Walthamstow. Big difference. And that was the irony and the comedy about the whole thing. But when Clyde Loakes, cabinet member for the environment, was invited to a meeting of local tenants, he didn't turn up. I sent him an email and I didn't mention Agenda 21. He said, thanks, Mark. But as I don't believe in an Agenda 21 takeover of the world, I find it of no value whatsoever. And he's implementing Agenda 21 and knows he's implementing Agenda 21. Another useful idiot. And the people who were at that meeting were, I think, Gordon Peters, who got the Haringey development vehicle taken down, where Lend-Lease were going to own half of Haringey. There was local campaigners. There was journalists. They were very credible people. But this is what you're up against, the consensus. And if you look at that borough and that stupid MP, that virtue signalling non-entity, who I will not even mention, the MP for Walthamstow, she's been there for so long, it's ridiculous, never achieved anything. Virtue signals, waffles, does nothing. Absolutely perfect for the job. Yes, quite interesting, actually, because when I moved there in 93, the way it changed by 2014 was unrecognizable. People walking around in a daydream thinking they were in a fantasy world and thinking it was some kind of big trendy place. But of course, there was Enfield and Kingston. They were also mini Hollands as well. And basically, mini Holland was the beginning of the smart city lockdown, because I found out that if you closed off 2 roads in that borough, you've got the place locked down. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but I think it was, it must have been about 15 years ago. There was helicopters above that borough and above London all the time. I was gigging all over the place. And all the pubs would say there was helicopters above at 3 o'clock in the morning. I think they were doing some new mapping, actually, for the lockdown of these areas. I'm sure that's what it's about, because these mini Hollands are just locked down. Everything can be locked down. They've closed the roads off. You can't get out. Close off 2 main roads. You've closed the borough. With about 8 police cars, you could make sure no one goes anywhere. And of course, the whole thing is to get you off the road and onto bikes. And people think this is a great idea. Well, it is, unless you want to go anywhere. But anybody who's actually had transport and knows that you need it to get around the country, well, you can't go on a bike. So this is all part of it. Tony Heller. I haven't heard any of Tony Heller's stuff. Bertie Bassett's put that. Tony Heller did a great video recently on consensus science titled 100 Authors Against Einstein. Yes, I met him. I think it was at Conway Hall years ago. And we put out a live stream from there, and I put up a lot of the videos. So some great speakers there, all marginalized, all academics, all people with so many qualifications you would not believe, who were actually in shock about the fraud that was going on in these educational establishments. Indeed, the man who put on this series of lectures about climate was a professor at the University of London. And when they found out that he was questioning the consensus, they pulled him. He'd been there about 30 years. He couldn't believe it. He was in shock, as these academics are, because they don't know the bigger picture. They just see the fraud. Covered this over and over again. We went to Fairborn in North Wales with an offer from the world's leading expert in sea levels, who was marginalized by the IPCC after calling them out on their fraud, saying, I'm not being part of a scientific fraud. Sea levels aren't going to rise like this. It's ridiculous. And now I've got these idiot friends. Well, they're not friends, I suppose. They're people who I know on Facebook. Actually, I know most of the people on Facebook are on my friends list. Most of them I do know, but being in the music business for quite a while, a lot of these people who were involved in it years ago are absolutely stupid. And they put on things like London's going to be underwater in 30 years. And they're falling for all this stuff. They are now the enemy. They are the ones who are queuing up for the jab. They're the ones who are going to go against you. Oh, yes. All of those rebels from years ago have now joined the human race. The human race, which has been genetically modified and dumbed down, which is not the human race anymore. Yeah, they don't have any working class friends from the local residents, a lot of ethnicities. None of their kids go to local comprehensive. I think they're talking about these London boroughs again here. Isn't it amazing, though, how these people have kind of sprouted up? Because through the Sustainable Development Goals and the Common Core education system, we had that since the 80s, really. But it was only really by 2000 that you started seeing the difference. And now we've got these clones everywhere, people who can't think for themselves. It's quite amazing what's happened in the UK. I don't think it's like that in every country. It's to a lesser or greater degree. It depends on how much they are going along with the Sustainable Development Goals within the education system. But yeah, everything really does come down to that. Ideological subversion, as Yuri Bezmenov explained, all concocted at the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. Now, the Tavistock is very interesting. I found out about them years ago. They were doing what was called social dreaming experiments at Occupy, which was deeply sinister, actually. And they had it on their website. So when I did a show at the People's Voice TV, I think it was, I said to them, or one of the researchers phoned up actually and said, oh, it's about your social dreaming experiments. And they said, what social dreaming experiments? We don't do that. And I said, yes, you do. It's on your website. Very, very strange. But yeah, the Tavistock, yeah, that came out of wartime propaganda, really. And there's a fellow called Dr. John Coleman. He wrote a book about it and the Committee of 300. I'm not sure where he got his information from. He says he got it from the British Library, but it's very, very interesting about the Harmsworth brothers who were behind it, and the way that the media was kind of changed and steered through it. And now what we've got is just the absolute result of that is complete control. And there's nothing outside the consensus. Yeah, the Tavistock, that is really interesting. That is really interesting. And all of these lobbying groups and steering groups and think tanks, policy exchange, the Demos is the big one. We debated with Demos at, I think it was Goldsmith College. And Jamie Bartlett, who was their poster boy at the time, was trying to debunk 9/11 so-called conspiracy theories. Yet an elementary science teacher in the audience debunked their non-theories, because basically what they did was quite interesting. This is the way this consensus reality works. They didn't know anything about the event itself, about 9/11. What they were trying to do was control the way people were allowed to talk about it. So when they were confronted with some facts, they had no argument whatsoever. And I said to Jamie Bartlett, I said, the problem is, Jamie, that the theory of how it happened is not possible. it's not possible, and explained why. And after 3 attempts at giving me his card, he gave up and went home. But yeah, that's interesting, because the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations and these steering groups and think tanks, I think Demos is probably the biggest of those, that is really linked into this, what people call Fabian socialism, but it's globalism now, really. It's just globalism. And there's so many of these people, they're out there, they are being trained up. There's armies of them. There's actually armies of them, like the terracotta army. There's loads of them. They're all stored, ready to go into action. And I just couldn't believe it when I saw this happening. The last 15 years, we've got the result now. But the agents were already embedded. And yeah, Yuri Bezmenov, watch Yuri Bezmenov, the Soviet defector, talking about ideological subversion. This is very important. It goes back to the consent thing I was talking about, because nothing can happen if a community, a real one, or a group of people cannot be subverted, then none of this can work. Therefore, the UK has been absolutely subverted. Now, I've been to countries that aren't subverted. It's quite interesting. They have a very strong sense of their own community. The degenerate side of what goes on and is allowed to be facilitated in Western countries is not allowed in these sort of countries. They are much more orientated to what they believe in and tight knit, but also, in my experience, quite accepting, which is very interesting. I find Britain now quite intolerable, an intolerant place, which it didn't used to be. The polarization through ideological subversion has been absolutely paramount to the success of what's going on at the moment. So yeah, back to small groups, I think. Yeah, indeed. Well, we're talking a bit about, yeah, I know. I knew Dr. John Coleman, former MI6. Yeah, he's quite interesting. I mean, I'm not sure where he got his stuff from. You know, I mean, the thing is with this intelligence services stuff, I find it quite interesting anyway, because people like David Shayler, for instance, I mean, I met him years ago, and I remember when he was going through everything he went through, when he exposed this plot to kill Gaddafi and other things. And I found that absolutely fascinating. A real whistleblower. The term whistleblower now just means they've been corralled into organizations which support whistleblowers. So everything is controlled. But yeah, I mean, I've always found it quite interesting, because years ago, when I started doing this, I actually found out how a lot of this stuff works. A dedicated website was set up to attack principally me, and they used some kind of wild conspiracy theory person as a kind of nemesis, which was completely weird. And I never understood it. I thought, why are they doing this? I was doing stuff really, which was about the law and the ancient kind of interpretations of law, where it came from, the bigger picture of esoteric. I was doing much more esoteric stuff then than I am now, in a way. I thought, well, why are they bothering with me? Well, it was because I was part of a group who were having huge success in the courts and exposing a lot of the fraud that was coming through the government. In actual fact, one government department actually got taken down. And that was on the back of a commercial affidavit, not a commercial lien, by the way, a commercial affidavit. And these small group of people, including myself and some others, were finding it fascinating. Then I was outside the Royal Courts of Justice. I won't mention the names of these people. I'm going to do a show on it, though, soon. But there's been so much more important stuff to cover that I thought I'd better kind of cover the important stuff. But this is interesting and in a way important, because I was outside the Royal Courts of Justice, and this man introduced himself to me, and he was very credible, not like a plant or anything like that. And he decided that him and his business partner would like to meet me and my friends. We used to have a meetup actually at a pub called the Shakespeare's Head in Holborn once a month. And he came along to that with his partner, who introduced himself to my friend as someone who'd worked for French military intelligence. And so the two of them came with us for a late drink. I was a bit suspicious because one of them was trying to get me interested in Panama. And I thought, why is he going on about Panama? This was before that Panama Papers. And he couldn't budge me on what I believed in, because I won't agree to anything that I don't want to do. So he was a bit pissed off about it, really, because I think they thought they could find stuff out, and I wasn't really going to do that. So I never saw these people again. And then this website carried on libeling me, and there was a character who we found out was working with the police because he turned up at the Bilderberg protest, which was in 2013 at Watford, which was organised by Goldman Sachs, by the way. How do I know that? Because Hertfordshire police told me. They said, this isn't a protest. He said, we're just being paid by Goldman Sachs to keep you lot in order. But he said, I don't even understand it. That was quite interesting, because that was another insight, which I won't go into now. But what happened was that these two who I'd met, who'd introduced themselves to me, and I never saw again, actually owned the company which owned the website, which was libeling me. And then I asked them to take it all down, never heard from them again. And now one of these people is pushing this free man on the land stuff. So it's quite interesting. And that's where I found out how public and private cross over. So in other words, these people who work for government intelligence are private contractors, and they might be doing a bit of work on the side. They might be doing hostile takeovers of companies. This particular person had a company that supplied voice over internet protocol phones. So he would have all of their data and be recording it on his own server, which means that these people can take down companies. I'm not saying he was going to, but he could do. And he was involved in radio, telecommunications, with Nortel, so many different organizations. And that's where I thought, this is really interesting. So, for instance, if somebody wants to, say, make an example of you, give you a hard time, cause you what the intelligence services call destabilization, demoralization, degradation, the 4 Ds: deny, degrade, disrupt, deceive. Deny, degrade, disrupt, deceive. That was a slideshow that I think Glenn Greenwald put out years ago. And I found that really interesting, because it showed you that they were trying to mess with people's minds, and they were trying to create cyber magicians on the internet. This was before 7-7 Brigade, which 7-7 Brigade is based in Reading, Berkshire. It's a bunch of 1,500 British troops and contractors, probably members of the public as well, who are controlling the narrative on social media. Now, this is interesting, because there was an article in The Guardian, I think, about them in 2014. So it's not new. And I did a show, and it's called Facebook's UK Army Trolls. And it's all about 7-7 Brigade. And it's all quotes from them, where they were being interviewed. And the sergeant major types gets interviewed by an army magazine. And so the army fella says, so is this a psychological operation on the British public? And he gave a classic MOD answer. He says, well, yes. No, he said no and yes. Classic MOD answer. No and yes. Perfect. So, yeah, I found out that these private contractors target people. So all this thing about this targeted individual thing is quite interesting as well, because I think that a lot of them who say they're targeted individuals aren't. I think they're fantasists, personally. There's one that I know is a complete fantasist. But we found that out years ago. I won't even go into it. It's just not even worth bothering with. But the point is that I think the people who are genuinely gang stalked are too shocked and too confused to actually even put it together as gang stalking, because they're just going, I don't even understand this. It's a destabilization. Again, deny, degrade, disrupt, deceive, the mantras. These are what they use. So when you see these sort of tactics being used, just step back. If it happens to you, step back and go, okay, I know what's happening here, because it's not as prevalent now. But about 5 to 10 years ago, there was a lot of internet harassment. Because of the way the internet's tightened up now, it's harder to find things. So it's harder actually to demonize people now. But we had a lot of it, and it went into a charity, of my friend's little charity. And that was a huge eye-opener as to how property developers are involved. Property developers are involved in protest, always have been. Be very wary of that. Be very wary of anyone from property development or property management who gets involved in protest, because they always will have an ulterior motive. And we found that out. They were actually employing people posing as Antifa to fight what they would call people who were right wing, which is, of course, a load of nonsense. None of it exists. And they managed to take a building. They actually took over a working charity building, defamed the trustees, kicked them all out. And the consequences of that went on for 3 years. And because it was a friend of mine, I was involved with this. It was a great little place, fantastic, but not what the globalists want. It was a proper community centre with all different people doing different stuff in there. That's not what they want. They want community hubs, which are controlled through sustainable development. So that was, I thought, very interesting. And that, again, was where I found out that there's this corporate side, which, of course, is all Agenda 21. It's very clever in some ways because it means that local government are working with these people. So property developers, the local council, the councillors, they're forming a mafia. And that's, again, all part of what the Sustainable Development Goals are all about. That's what it's all about. It's to get people locked down without a voice. And, of course, loads of boroughs joined together. This was another thing I put in my talks, that you've got all these boroughs now joined together, like in Oxford. Look how many councils are one council. Buckinghamshire, I think. There's look all over the country, just put councils becoming conglomerates, basically, which means that there's no town hall. So the town hall disappears and you've got no contact apart from a call centre. So they are completely alien to the public that they serve. In other words, there's no liability on their part anymore. And this is what I found out with the council tax years ago. I was getting really interested in that. So if you want to know anything about council tax, go to windowsontheworld.net and put in council tax. It all comes up, and everything there, I promise you, is absolutely spot on and true. It's not legal advice, but this is how they do it. And that has now gone into every other organisation. As we said earlier, debt collectors with the county court, basically not really taking you to county court, but saying there's a county court judgment against you and all sorts of things like that, with their friends in the court who issue the paperwork, with their friends who are bailiffs and debt collectors. It's all linked together. So basically, that's, again, part of sustainable development, a global mafia. It's nothing to do with saving the planet. It's to do with controlling you so that you have no recourse within this system. And of course, that's what this new health pass and the rest of it and the biometrics is all about. But yeah, I think I've probably gone through quite a lot of stuff there. I didn't intend to, but I've quite enjoyed it. It's good to see the comments coming up, actually, because last week's show, Freeman versus Technocracy, do take a look at it. Have a look at that, because I didn't advertise it last week and it probably needs to get out there a bit more, that one. But I'll be doing a show tomorrow, Monday, which will be a live shows page, windowsontheworld.net. And if you want me to cover anything, if there's anything that you find interesting, give me a call, windowsontheworld.net, info@windowsontheworld.net, because I get some people sending me really interesting stuff, which I don't always have time to cover. But if there's anything that you want me to cover on one of these live streams, it'd be good, because I'd like to do something more interactive. It'd be great. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's probably about it, actually. I've been waffling on for 1 hour and 17 minutes. I'm usually more disciplined, but a lot of things came to mind during that. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. And yes, do join us every Sunday, 9:30 p.m. UK time, windowsontheworld.net, and look out for what we do during the week. If you can help us out, please do. It's just me at Windows Towers. And yes, it's not a green screen. These are real bricks behind me. And I will be back. Thanks, Matt. Just tuned in. We'll watch full show later. Yeah, it's me waffling in a useful way, I hope. Lots of things covered there. And I've really enjoyed it. So thanks for being there. It's great. Where is the council tax money going? Certainly not maintaining the vegetation, rewilding on our estate, weeds and pavements and roads. Yeah, well, of course. I mean, we can get into the council tax thing at a future date, but yeah, just look it up at windowsontheworld.net. You'll find loads of interesting stuff. I went into that. I actually went to the point of bankruptcy with council tax, found out the whole thing's a scam, found out loads of things were a scam, and actually managed to win back a lot of credibility against them. I used to love doing it. I went into court and I won a court case against Waltham Forest Council. I buried them in a lot of ways, but those days are probably behind us now, and things of much more importance, like our lives, are now on the line. So I'll leave it there. Utilities companies, what's going on with them? Yeah, well, actually, Paul Webster's very good on that. Bills of Exchange Act and all that stuff. Look him up. I think it's water board stuff. I did a few shows with him a while ago, and he's quite on it with that. The liabilities, etc. But with what I've said here tonight about the debt collectors, that's all true, and it's all stuff that we worked out a long time ago. So a lot of this stuff, there's nothing to be afraid of. And what's interesting actually is the more you jump into this and throw caution to the wind, but not too much. Well, I was a bit reckless, I have to admit. I was cutting clamps off my car every week at one point, and we had some very comedic things happen. I might do a show on it sometime to lighten things up, because it was so funny what happened. We freaked a lot of people out, a lot of media people, who one of them was working with us on something we were filming in Camden, and when he knew what we were up to, and he thought the police were chasing us. Absolutely hilarious. I think that was his last chance of being a journalist. He disappeared, never to be seen again. That's another story. Mark, you are knowledgeable. Thank you. Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff I can talk about, and I think a lot of the thing is that I like to put out very concise information. So if I do these things, I can go from one thing to another very quickly, and there's a lot of information in there. All of it's pretty useful, I think. So yeah, sir, I demand equity. Quite right too. Yes, equity will not allow a statute to be used as a cloak for fraud. That's a great legal maxim. I love legal maxims. They're great. Can't we just make a parallel society? Use stealth. Exactly. That's what I've been talking about, Tara. Thanks a lot for that. Really brilliant. Great comments. We have great listeners. Thanks a lot, everybody. And yeah, tune in tomorrow. It's really good to know that there's people out there. Thanks a lot, everyone. Good night.